Soldier's Heart by Alex 51324. Chapter 27. November 1917. 10th of November 1917. Barrow! Had a letter from Manning. He and a bunch of others have been transferred out to infantry. Him, Morris, and Cadman from our crowd. The new lads are safe as they're not A1s. Manning says he's pleased to get a chance to kill some Bashi, but I'm not sure he means it. Anyway, they got Paris leave before they had to go join their new unit, and they had a drink with some Yanks. He says they're all enormous corn-fed types. Did you see the newsreel when they paraded through Paris? And they get paid more than us, so the girls won't even give a Tommy the time of day if there's an American to be had. Word is they even got around to doing some fighting last week. Back here in London, they've worked out the problem with my false foot, and I'm up and about pretty well now. They've let me out a few times now, pub, cinema, and everyone says that means a medical panel isn't far behind. I don't mind, it's dead boring being in hospital when you aren't ill. Mother's keen on having me home once I get out, but I think I'd just as soon have home service. The MOs here say that it could go either way, but when that happens, they take into account what you want. A man who wants to work will try harder to overcome his disability, etc. I have hinted that a small hospital in the country would suit me well, so if you work things from your end, something may come of it. Rollins. I'm afraid the news is worse than we thought, Major Clarkson said. He'd been summoned to London to discuss personnel reassignments. They all knew what that meant, so Thomas and Sister Crawley had planned to meet him on his return to find out what the damage was and sort out what they'd do about it. They were gathered now in the Major's office in the hospital. We're losing half of the men. The most well-trained and physically fit, of course. He passed a roster to Sister Crawley, who scanned it and said, Was there nothing you could do? They wanted Corporal Wiggins as well, Major Clarkson said. Wiggins had been promoted to corporal a few weeks ago at Thomas's recommendation. I had to pull all the strings I had to keep him. Sister Crawley handed Thomas the roster. The Major had been kidding about them losing their best. Palmer, Franklin, most of the original lot. What are they giving us in the way of replacements, sir? They promised us at least 8, eventually. New recruits and wounded men transferred in from other branches. 8 men to replace 11, and they'd be lucky to get half of them immediately. It tied in with what Rollins had said in his letter about men from the 47th being transferred out. They'd be pulling the most fit men they had to fill those places, and then the next most fit to replace them, and so on back to here, the rear of the rear. It's going to be tough, sir, he said. We'll need to keep the most experienced ones of those remaining to us for the hospital, Sister Crawley said. I'm sorry, but the convalescent home duties are less exacting. The new men can begin there. She wasn't wrong. In that case, I'll need Wiggins up at the convalescent home to help train them. Wiggins currently divided his time between the hospital and the convalescent home, at least for the first couple of weeks. Sister Crawley shook her head. We'll have at least one convoy in that time, perhaps 2. I might be able to do without him on the other days, but not those. Convoy days here mean new patients up at the convalescent home, too, Thomas pointed out. The ones moved out of the hospital to make room for the new arrivals. They always need more watching when they first go up. Not medically, so much as to help them find their way around the sprawling labyrinth of Downton Abbey, and to keep them from wandering into places they weren't supposed to go. What they could do was swap Wiggins for one of the other relatively experienced men. Griff, maybe, he was saying. On those days. It wasn't ideal, but it would just about work. But he wouldn't suggest it just yet. There was something Sister Crawley usually said in discussions like this, and he wanted her to say it now. She didn't disappoint. What we need, she declared, as though this would be news to anyone, is another corporal. That's easier said than done, Major Clarkson reminded her. As a matter of fact, I asked about that again when I met with the War Office. They said what they always say. They're unavailable. As a setup, it couldn't be better. Thomas assumed a thoughtful expression, and Major Clarkson said, Do you have an idea, Sergeant? More of a passing thought, sir, he said. That friend of mine I told you about from my old unit. His medical board's coming up, and he thinks it's likely he'll be cleared for home service. Major Clarkson nodded. They may already have something in mind for him, he pointed out. Remind me, what's his disability? He's missing a foot, sir. In other words, he'd be in a low enough fitness classification they had a chance of getting him. I haven't seen him since summer, but he says he's getting around quite well on his artificial one. Sister Crawley chimed in. Then a small hospital would be the best place for him. Some of the city ones, the orderlies and nurses walk miles in a shift. Looking thoughtful, Major Clarkson said, And he's a corporal? Yes, sir. He took over my old section when I was wounded, so I haven't seen him in action as an NCO, but he was a great help when we got our new recruits in spring of 16. If I'm going to run the convalescent home with only new men, there's no one I'd rather have. What's his name? Major Clarkson asked, reaching for a pen. Rollins, Thomas said, and spelled it. P. Rollins. I'm not sure of his first name. And when's his medical board? It hasn't been scheduled yet, sir, or hadn't when he wrote to me. They just said it would be soon. Good, said Major Clarkson. That makes it less likely someone else has already claimed him. I'll see what I can do, he promised. With that decided, they moved on to the finer details of the duty roster. Most of the transfers would be leaving for a couple of weeks, but 3 were going in a few days, requiring an immediate rearrangement. They went round and round on the subject for a while, but Thomas eventually had to concede that it made the most sense to reduce convalescent home complement by 2 and the hospitals by 1. I don't know how I'll manage it, sir, without the nurses taking on more of the heavy work, he warned. I do know how her ladyship feels about that. The nurses themselves didn't mind tending fires and mopping floors, but Lady Grantham objected strenuously. Major Clarkson sighed. Is there any way we could reduce the night shift to 1? Someone, Thomas thought it was Lady Grantham, had brought that up last week when the staffing changes were only speculative. Very few of the convalescent home patients needed attention during the night, so there wasn't really enough work for 2 men. But there was always the chance of an emergency, and if one arose, they'd need 1 man to attend to it and another to fetch Thomas from the top of the house. Thomas had promised to think about it, but hadn't come up with much. Is there any way the War Office would pay for a hall boy? He asked. Someone under military age who could look after the fires at night and run for help in an emergency. Mr. Carson can't spare one of his. The house had recently gotten a second after Carson had tried in vain to find another footman to replace Lang. But if there was a 3rd one, on similar terms as the kitchen and laundry helpers, Sister Crawley objected. We can't have a child working all night. All boys are at least 14, ma'am, Thomas pointed out. For some reason, Sister Crawley did not appear mollified by this information. Major Clarkson said, The War Office is reluctant to employ boys under military age. Have you any other ideas? He had one more, but he didn't like it much. If we're badly pressed, sir, I could keep in my office and be sort of on call, he said. But I have a feeling if I'm right there, the threshold for an emergency is going to be a lot lower, especially once we get new men in. Don't know how long I'd be able to keep it up. I agree, it's not a long-term solution, Major Clarkson said. It might be, Sister Crawley said. They both looked at her, Thomas with no small amount of surprise and betrayal. There'd been a bit of a distance between them since he'd put her in her place about the convalescent home, but he hadn't thought it reached the level of a falling out. She went on. What I mean is, it doesn't have to be Sergeant Barrow every night, does it? The men could take turns being on call and also working a regular shift. Now, why hadn't Thomas thought of that? The only answer that sprang to mind was a slight inclination toward martyrdom, which he promptly put to one side as soon as he thought of it. That could work, he said slowly. It won't be popular with the men, Major Clarkson noted. Not a bit, sir, he agreed. But if I take the first turn at it, that'll take some of the sting out. And by the time his turn came around again, they'd all know how irritating it was to be woken up for nothing when you had to put in a full day's work the next day. Thinking aloud, he said, We'll keep the rotations short. A full week is probably too much. 3 or 4 days. Breakfast and dinner in the servants' hall, so they won't be trudging back and forth to the village on top of it all. Might need you to put your foot down about that, sir, he added. They might not. It was hard to guess what to expect these days from Carson. They decided to try it, starting at the beginning of next week, when the first of the transfers would be leaving. Thomas would go first, followed by Wiggins and then Griff, who were both easygoing enough to accept an onerous assignment without too much grousing, and popular enough that his example would encourage the others. When the meeting finished, Sister Crawley walked outside with Thomas. Must you rush back? she asked. "I'd hoped to pick your brain about the blood grouping scheme."
"I expect they could do without me for a bit longer," he said. "What's happening with it?"
Thinking back, it seemed that Sister Collie's updates on the scheme had dwindled off. All of the nurses and orderlies had been tested for it in late summer, but Thomas didn't remember hearing much about it since then. "I haven't been able to get as much support from the community as I'd like," she explained. "That is, I've spoken to every committee woman in the village about it, and they all think it's a splendid idea, and I'm sure to have many volunteers. But when it comes to actually testing them, everyone has a reason why she can't. This one faints at the sight of blood, that one has too many obligations to commit to donating if suitable, and so on."
"I see," Thomas said, wondering what she wanted him to do about it. "Well, a number of the household staff said they were willing when we first discussed it. I could talk to them about it.
That might get them another handful of donors. Even if they all got tested, only a few would be in the donor group, but it wouldn't be as many as they needed."
"What if you had a sort of event in the parish hall or the school or somewhere? If they see others being tested, it'll seem like it's the thing to do."
"But who will they see being tested?" Sister Collie said. "The problem is that no one is willing."
"Get the orderlies and nurses to go again," Thomas said. "You don't actually have to test the repeat samples, just take them for show. We'll get some of the convalescent home patients to go too. That's not a lot of help to have them on the roster, since by the time they're well enough to donate, they're almost well enough to leave, but the point is for people to see them doing it. And the household staff, the working class people around here think we're a bit grand and—"
"Oh!" He stopped in his tracks.
"What? If we can get Lord Grantham or one of the ladies to do it, that's the whole thing right there. Have him or her go in the middle of the morning while everyone's out going to the shops, and we have a group of orderlies or nurses or patients just before, so there's a queue and plenty of time for all the village gossips to see the Earl of Grantham doing his bit."
"I see," she said. Yes, that could work. And perhaps they get a sort of badge to show they've taken part." She glanced at the watch pinned to her blouse. "I shan't have time to speak to Cousin Cora or Cousin Robert today, but perhaps tomorrow."
If she tried to steamroller them into it, they'd kick. "Might be best to get the ball rolling before you approach them," he suggested. "Decide where to have it, put up posters, and so on."
That would give Thomas some time to have Bates and Anna work on his lordship and the young ladies. O'Brien would be no help with Lady Grantham, but Lady Sybil might be able to handle her.
That way they'll already know it's happening, and you can say you're worried people won't turn out, and so on.
"I see," she said. "In that case, I shall speak to the vicar tomorrow at the parish hall, and perhaps he can put it in the Pew Bulletin. Oh, there's a great deal to do." There were, in fact, loads of details to sort out, and since that was precisely what Sister Collie liked best, he left her happily working away at them. It was a cold day, but not wet, and Thomas forsook the curving drive to cut across the grounds. Sometimes he ran into Lang doing that. He'd been unsure when summer ended if there was still much work for an under-gardener to do, but it seemed there was. But this time he ran into Nurse Crawley instead, having a sly cigarette in the shelter of the folly they called the Etruscan Temple. She waved him over, so he leaned against the railing of the temple and lit a cigarette of his own. He told her the bad news about the personal transfers, but she didn't seem terribly interested. Something else on her mind, Thomas guessed. He felt silent, and after a moment she said, "Do you think it's possible for someone else to know your mind better than you yourself do?"
What kind of a question was that? "I don't know,"
he said, and then thought of Peter telling him that he'd like to live in a cottage with somebody nice and keep house.
Thomas had denied it, but Peter had been right. "Maybe. Sometimes."
"How do you know if it's one of those times?" she asked. "Or if if the person is just saying what they'd like to be true."
"What did Birdsett say to you this time?" He shrugged slightly, not sure what to say.
She went on. "If it is true, wouldn't you recognize it right away? Think, oh yes, of course, that's what I've been missing."
"Not necessarily." The only way he knew how right Peter had been was how it felt now, knowing it was even more impossible than it had been when Peter first suggested it. "Not if it's something that it wouldn't do you any good to admit it."
She said, tossing down her cigarette end. She smoothed her nursing uniform. "Thank you, Sergeant." Still unsure what that had been about,
"Though we had a guess or two,"
Thomas walked with her up to the house. When they arrived, the rest of the nurses were leaving the breakfast room after their tea. Nurse Crawley must have cut hers short or skipped it entirely to sneak her cigarette and ponder whatever mysterious thing Branson had told her about herself. Over the orderly's tea, Thomas gave the news to the men who were being transferred. Most were going to larger hospitals in England, Franklin and Cartwright to base hospitals in France. None of them were going into danger, but the atmosphere was still a bit solemn. When Thomas added that they wouldn't be getting replacements immediately and explained the new plan for night duty, it actually lightened the mood a bit by giving them all something to grumble about. You get close to people, Thomas thought, and then they move you around like cattle. Except that farmers knew the cows had friends. After tea, he made a walk through the wards, checking that everything was as it should be. As he passed through the recreation room, Lady Edith pulled him aside. "Sergeant," she said, "I thought you should know. Major Bryant has been bothering one of the maids again."
"Yes, my lady," Thomas said automatically. "I'll speak to him again. Do you happen to know which maid it was?"
She sighed. "Ethel."
"I see. Most of the maids make an effort to avoid him, my lady."
Ethel did it because what was euphemistically described as bothering the maids did not in fact bother her. "I expect that's wise," she said. "I avoid him as well."
"His medical panel's coming up," Thomas offered. "I expect they'll pass him through. He's fully recovered, so he'll be out of our hair before much longer."
"I hope so," she said. "But in the meantime, please speak to him."
"I will, my lady."
She nodded and went off to speak to one of the more likable officers.
As he finished his walk-through, Thomas wondered why Lady Edith had thought it necessary to tell him about Major Bryant and Ethel. She knew what the Major was like. Her comment about avoiding him proved it. Perhaps she was just fed up, but Thomas decided to go downstairs and check with Miss Hughes, just in case there was something he was missing. At the bottom of the stairs he met Mr. Carson, who was about to take the family's tea up.
"Sergeant Barrow,"
he said crisply.
"how nice of you to join us. Is there anything you need?"
Since being ordered to adopt a more welcoming attitude to the convalescent home staff, and to Thomas in particular, Carson had taken to addressing him with exaggerated politeness. Thomas, after some consideration, had decided to find it funny.
"And a very good day to you, Mr. Carson," he said. "I was just looking for Miss Hughes."
"I believe," Carson said, "that she is in her sitting room."
"Thank you,"
Thomas said. Carson continued up the stairs, and Thomas went to Mrs. Hughes' sitting room. She was indeed there, going over some household accounts, which she put aside willingly enough when he asked if she had a moment. Once they were seated in front of her fire, Thomas said,
"Lady Edith told me she'd seen one of the officers bothering Ethel. I wanted to ask if she had said anything."
Miss Hughes coughed. "She didn't have to. I saw the tail end of it."
"Where were they?"
If Ethel had gotten herself into deeper water than she'd planned, if Bryant had her penned in a cupboard or something, that might explain Lady Edith's troubling herself. "In the library. She was meant to be dusting the small library, but I suppose the temptation was too much to resist."
"Just the usual sort of thing, then. I'll speak to him again, but there isn't much I can do if she encourages him," Thomas said. Harassing a respectable woman might be considered ungentlemanly behavior, a military offense in an officer, but flirting with a girl who flirted right back was well within bounds.
"I've already spoken to her," Miss Hughes said. "The trouble is, with so many girls in factories and doing ward work these days, it's difficult to replace a maid, and she knows it."
Since Thomas was here, he gave Miss Hughes the news of the men transferring out. "They've promised us at least 8 men to replace the 11 we're losing, but the new ones will arrive more slowly than the old ones leave, and they'll have to be trained before they're good for much. I don't expect we'll be able to spare anyone for extra projects for a while." There were a few things she'd mentioned, hoping the maids and orderlies could tackle together. Fortunately, the most significant of them, changing out the summer draperies for the winter ones, had been done last week.
"That isn't very convenient," she noted, "but I suppose we'll have to manage. Do you know where the men will be going? Not to the front, I hope."
"No," Thomas said. "Not us. They're moving some men to the front. That's why all this shuffling about is happening. But none of the ones here are past fit for active service. They're mostly going to other hospitals in Britain, a couple to base hospitals in France. They should be all right. Unless the war dragged on long enough that they ran out of men in the higher fitness categories. Putting that grim thought aside, he added, "It'll be tricky losing so many in one go. Most of the new men will start out here because the work's less complicated than at the hospital. It'll take some time for them to get used to the way we do things here. Most will have come from France, probably." Thomas hoped she'd grasp the implication that they would not have spent much time in mixed company recently.
"I understand," Miss Hughes said, and added tartly, "We might have to put a bell on Ethel."
They spoke of one or two other minor matters, and Thomas left, deciding to make a pass through the kitchen. Miss Patmore had been complaining lately about the kitchen helpers, but at the moment, at least, they seemed to be hard at work preparing a small mountain of vegetables, likely destined for the patients' and servants' dinners. When she saw him, Daisy wiped her hands on her apron and called to Miss Patmore, "I'm going out to get the chickens." Catching his eye, she jerked her head toward the door meaningfully, and not very subtly either. Deciding he might as well find out what she wanted before she resorted to semaphore, Thomas headed outside, taking his cigarettes out of his pocket as he did so. He lit up while Daisy was messing around with the latch on the meat safe and waited. "William's coming," she blurted out. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but not that. "Why?" If he was wounded, Thomas thought she'd have opened with that. "On leave," she said. "Him and Captain Crawley." In Thomas's experience, officers' servants didn't usually get to go on leave with them, but then junior officers didn't usually run back to England every other week either. The rules must be different for a future earl, even if he was pretending to be a provincial solicitor. "That's nice," Daisy scoffed. "What am I going to do?"
"About what?"
An obvious answer presented itself. "Keep your knickers on and your knees together," he said. This was Anna-approved advice. He couldn't possibly get in trouble for saying it. "Thomas!" It had been a long time since someone had said Thomas in that scandalized tone. He found he sort of missed it.
"I didn't mean like that,"
she continued. Thomas took a drag on his cigarette. "Then what did you mean?"
"About him thinking we're engaged."
"Aren't you?" He vaguely remembered her expressing some doubts before William's last minute. But when the engagement had been announced, he'd had other things to worry about.
"Not really," she said and explained. "When he started going on about having something important to ask me, I was trying to say what we talked about not being sure and just being friends for now, but Miss Patmore stuck her oar in and started going on about how it was just what I wanted."
"She answered your proposal for you? Was everyone here completely barmy?"
"He looked so happy I couldn't tell him she were making it up," Daisy said.
When she put it that way, Thomas supposed she couldn't. Idly, he wondered whether in some world where people like him were normal, everyone would have shoved him at Peter the way they shoved Daisy and William. And if they had, whether it would have helped. Pushing that thought aside, he asked, "Can you now?"
Daisy sighed. "I thought you might have some idea."
Nothing sprang to mind. "I don't see how," he said. "There isn't another bloke, is there?" She shook her head quickly.
"Nothing like that. Of course not. I feel like I'm leading him up the garden path. Stringing him along like."
"Well, if he's happier being strung along." She didn't look convinced, so Thomas added, "It's not like letting him think you're engaged is going to stop him finding someone else. The girls soldiers meet in France aren't the kind you marry." He remembered Griff's line about men laying down their lives. William wasn't even asking her to lay down. "Consider it a private contribution to the war effort," he suggested, "keeping your spirits up and all."
"That's what Miss Patmore says. That, and I can take back my promise later."
She wasn't wrong. "You didn't seem that down in the dumps about it back when it happened," he pointed out.
"Well, it was exciting being engaged."
Thomas supposed it would be, at least until the cold realization set in that one was engaged to William. "If I think of anything, I'll let you know," he said. "But don't hold your breath." She sighed again and hefted a tub full of chickens out of the meat safe.
"Get the door for me?"
By that night's dinner, everyone had heard about William's impending visit, and the subject dominated the conversation. It wasn't until Daisy was bringing out the pudding that he managed to slip a word in edgewise about Sister Crawley's blood-grouping scheme.
"Wouldn't people rather be tested in private?"
Miss Hughes asked once Thomas had outlined the plan. "That's what she thought, but they keep putting her off," Thomas explained. "We're hoping that if everyone can see who's doing their bit and who isn't, it'll be harder to refuse." "I could see that," Bates said, nodding.
What is it you want from us?
Thomas attempted to look innocent, but Bates added,
You wouldn't be telling us if you didn't want us to do something.
Bates had him there.
Well, it won't work if nobody steps forward, Thomas admitted. We need some to go first and set the example.
I'll do it, Ethel said. So will I, Anna added. What about you, Mr. Bates?
She looked at him with an expression that was gooier than usual, and he returned it, saying,
If you are, then I suppose I must.
A few others agreed to take part in the blood-grouping fete, including Miss Hughes. Carson, when asked, only habaved. Miss Patmore, who came in to see what was keeping Daisy, proclaimed herself on the fence.
I won't say, but it's a good thing, but I don't know if I dare.
In Daisy's shoes, Thomas would probably have announced that Miss Patmore had been saying she wanted nothing more than the opportunity to give some of her blood to somebody else. But Daisy either didn't think of it or somehow restrained herself. Thomas didn't think he ought to explain the second part of the plan, the part where they roped in at least one of the upstairs lots in front of Carson. So when Daisy started clearing the table, Thomas caught Anna's eye and inclined his head very slightly toward the door. She nodded just as minutely, but then spoiled it all by coming out right on his heels and bringing Bates with her. Honestly, he might as well have just announced that they were coming outside to have a private talk. While he was still in the process of lighting up, Anna burst out with,
Mr. Bates has had a letter.
Thomas, his mouth occupied with the cigarette, raised an eyebrow. Bates sighed.
A friend of mine works at a hotel in Portsmouth.
He said,
He saw Vera there.
Vera was Mr. Bates' wife, but Thomas was still unsure why they were telling him this. And?
With a man, Anna added. They signed the register as husband and wife and spent the night.
Thomas opened his mouth and closed it again. He could tell from Anna's tone of voice that this was meant to be good news, but he wasn't sure why. Vera had been stringing Bates along on the topic of divorce since before the war, saying she'd grant it if Bates promised this or paid for that. This wasn't the first time Anna had gotten her hopes up. "How much difference does that make?" he asked. He knew how significant it could be if two men were caught in a hotel room together, but adultery wasn't against the law.
All the difference in the world,
Bates proclaimed.
If she's been unfaithful and I can prove it, I don't need her consent to divorce her.
Oh, Thomas thought quickly. You haven't written to her, have you? I mean, she doesn't know that you know.
Not yet,
Bates said.
I have to think about how to make sure she can't wriggle out of it.
Yes, he most certainly did.
She'll say your mate's lying, Thomas pointed out. So the first thing you've got to do is get him to cut the page out of the hotel register. Anna frowned. Why? So she... As he started to answer, Thomas realized he had it backwards. He'd never been on this side of one of these situations before. No, sorry. The first thing she'd have to do is get the page out of the register. You've got to make sure she can't. Separated from the hotel register, the page wouldn't be worth much more than Bates's friend's word. Have him spill some ink or something on it, on the blank pages. They might take it out of his wages, but you can pay him back for it. Now it was Bates's turn to open his mouth and close it again. Anna, glancing back and forth between them, said, Why exactly? It occurred to Thomas that perhaps neither of them had ever been in one of these situations before, from either side. As long as the register's sitting out on the front desk, it's easy enough to nick a page out of it. All you have to do is have somebody lure the clerk away, then cut it out quick while no one's looking. If you're careful to cut near the binding, no one will ever notice. Especially if the page you want is a few pages back from the current one.
I see,
Bates said.
But if it's obviously damaged, they'll have to start a new one.
Exactly, Thomas said. And they'll store the old one in the manager's office or somewhere like that, in case the police ever ask for it to check somebody's whereabouts on the night in question. This detail Thomas knew mainly from detective stories. The blokes he knew were usually more worried about blackmail or word getting back to their wives.
Will he have put his real name, though?
Anna asked. Only if you're really lucky and he's really stupid, Thomas answered. But even if it's a false one, it'll back up your mate's story. And the handwriting could be matched to the man's, maybe. They were always doing that in detective stories anyway.
Do you suppose she'll think of it?
Anna asked Bates.
Stealing the page from the register, I mean.
Probably,
Bates said.
His mind works the same way hers does.
Oi! Thomas objected. Bates made an apologetic sort of shrug.
Do you have any other ideas?
Thomas thought. She hasn't got much to lose trying to brazen it out, has she? A man accused of gross indecency would meet any halfway reasonable demand to avoid having the secret even hinted at publicly, but a divorced woman was an object of scandal whether she was a confirmed adulteress or not. I mean, if you have her anything less than dead to rights, she might just as soon fight it as grant the divorce to keep it quiet.
She might,
Bates agreed.
and probably would if she thinks fighting it would make me suffer along with her.
Then you'd better try and find out who the man is before you tip your hand. If he's married too, or if his job depends on him being respectable, it might put some pressure on her to go quietly and keep him out of it. Once they know you know, they'll be a lot more careful about covering their tracks.
How will we find out who he is? Anna wondered aloud. I don't suppose your friend recognized him as a regular guest at the hotel, she asked hopefully.
He didn't mention it,
Bates said.
but I expect he would have if he did know the man.
He might have put his real address, or the address of someone he knows, Thomas suggested. It's harder to make up an address than a name. At least someone or other had made that observation on an occasion requiring such subterfuge. It might have been George Hargraves, or possibly Elliot Cavendish. Whomever it was, he'd confessed to putting the address of his club for want of anything better, and that had been one of the times Thomas had resorted to register page-nicking. Unfortunately, with that observation, Thomas reached the limits of his relevant experience. They kicked around several ideas for determining the identity of the man, but most were derived from detective stories. Apparently Anna had read her share of them too, and not at all practical for three amateurs, all of whom had jobs from which they would be missed if they, say, attempted to stake out the address from the hotel register in hopes of spotting Vera's paramour.
Where are the Baker Street irregulars when you need them?
Bates mused. London peculiars, Thomas corrected abstractly. They were all dead was what they were. What? Anna asked. Belatedly, Thomas realized what he'd said. Never you mind, I suppose the first thing is to get your friend to write you the details from the register and a description of what the bloke looks like. The others agreed to the step, and Anna said plaintively, Can we go inside now? I'm freezing! They hadn't talked about the blood donor plan yet, but Thomas was freezing too, so he didn't argue. 12th of November, 1917. Rollins. That's too bad about Manning and everyone. We just found out we're losing about half our men. Just to bigger hospitals, a couple to base hospitals in France. But I reckon they're going down the line, sending the fittest men one step forward all the way from the front line units back here to the rear of the rear. Works out all right for us, though, because whatever replacements we get will be green as grass, at least as far as hospital work goes. I told my CO I had a line on an experienced RAMC corporal who might be cleared for home service soon, and he's pretty keen. Can't promise anything, of course, but he'll see what he can do. Things aren't too bad here. We're busy enough, and once the men start leaving, we're all going to be working like one-legged men in ours, kicking goddess Carsons. Still off my back. The patients are planning a concert, but luckily the ladies of the house have taken an interest, so it isn't making much extra work for me. I did see that newsreel. I hope the Hun have seen it too. Barrow. 12th of November, 1917. WT. Rollins is up on his feet, one natural, one artificial, and is expecting a medical panel soon. I talked my CO into trying to get him here so he might write to Major Thwaite to check his bona fides. We're losing about half our men, the fittest and most experienced snatch, to larger hospitals, so I could use some help training whatever we get in the way of replacements, and Rollins is pretty good at that. This story has the advantage of being completely true. Hope you're well. TB. Leaving the tobacconist's shop, Thomas noticed a man examining one of Miss Crawley's posters, which was stuck in the window. Curious as to the effect her campaign was having on the hoi polloi, Thomas fell in beside him and started opening the packet of cigarettes he just bought. The sign read, Can you save a life? Blood donors urgently needed. Find out more and learn if you are suitable. Under that was some fine print giving the location, the parish hall, and the date and times, and instructions to inquire at the hospital for further information. The man glanced over at him, his eyes flicking to the RAMC tabs on Thomas's collar, and he said,
What's this about then, Sarge?
Thomas launched into the now familiar explanation of how blood transfusion worked, noting as he did so that the man was thin-faced and ragged, leaning on a battered wooden cane. He was of military age. The implication was obvious. He'd come home wounded and couldn't work. Probably sleeping rough, or the nearest thing to it. Thomas thought of the highwaymen he and Nurse Crawley had joked about last winter. The man listened to Thomas's recitation with a pretense of interest, and at the end of it asked,
Do they pay you for that?
"Afraid not," Thomas said. "You get a cup of tea and a biscuit, but that's about it." The man looked as though he might think it worth it anyway. Though Thomas didn't think much of his chances of giving blood without fainting. He looked like a strong wind might knock him over. To buy himself time to think, Thomas took out a cigarette, offering the man one as he did so. The man took it with a muttered,
Cheers, mate.
Thomas lit his own cigarette and handed the man the matches. He'd had to buy flints for his lighter, too.
Tell you what, though, stop by the hospital and ask to see the ward sister.
He wasn't sure she ought to be bothered. Captain Crawley and William had been due back days ago, and no sign of them. But she did like organizing people's lives for them, so it might be just the thing to take her mind off it.
She's the one organizing it. Might have something you can do.
They both looked dubiously at the man's cane, and Thomas added,
Hanging up more posters or out like that?
You think?
The man asked hopefully.
We're short-handed.
It wasn't a lie. 6 of the outgoing transfers had left already, and so far they'd had only 2 new men to replace them. More to the point, though, there was often something left after they'd given the patients their dinners, and it wouldn't harm anyone if this bloke ate it.
Where'd you get your packet?
He asked.
The Psalm.
The man said.
Where else?
Thomas took a drag on his cigarette.
Me too.
Looking him over, the man said,
Must not have been too bad.
No,
Thomas agreed.
I was lucky.
The man smiled humorlessly.
So were I. Compared to some.
Walking back up to the house, Thomas tried to put the man out of his mind. It was easier once he got there, as there was plenty to occupy him. Dressing changes alone took longer than ever, with fewer men to do them, and 2 of them needing to be shown how. And on top of that, the patients were busy practicing their performances for the concert, and several had to be dragged down and coaxed away from their rehearsals when it was their turn. With all that, they were late getting the main hall set up for the patients' evening meal, and consequently just as late clearing it. Thomas was supervising the 2 new lads in moving the tables and chairs back against the walls when Carson came up to admit the Dowager Countess and Miss Crawley, who were dining with the family that night. At least Carson now refrained from commenting on the situation and kept his huffing and glowering to a bare minimum. Still, Thomas breathed a sigh of relief when the 2 ladies arrived, and Carson's attention was taken up with escorting them to the small library. His relief was short-lived. Miss Crawley broke away from the procession, calling, "Sergeant!" Thomas did not quite brace up, but made sure he was standing up straight.
Mum?
He said. In ringing tones, she said, "Did you send a man to the hospital to speak to me this afternoon?" Carson had been continuing toward the small library with the Dowager Countess in tow, but now turned its head to look at Thomas. Carefully ignoring him, Thomas said,
Yes, ma'am. He seemed to be in a bit of a bad way. I thought you might have some ideas.
Quite right, she said. He's not been able to find work because of his disability, but the War Office has refused him a pension.
Her tone was as indignant as if she'd been personally insulted.
Yes, ma'am,
Thomas said. That happened fairly often, the War Office having a different idea of whether or not a man was capable of work than a potential employer did.
And it seems he isn't the only one, she went on. He says there are a number of others in the area who are similarly situated.
She seemed to be waiting for him to say something.
Ma'am.
Well, I think it's a disgrace, she proclaimed. These men have served our country, and now they've been abandoned.
Yes, ma'am,
Thomas agreed. What did you want him to do about it?
She nodded crisply. I mustn't keep the others waiting, but we'll speak more of this later.
With that, she rejoined Carson, who watched Thomas with an unreadable expression. Thomas supposed that Miss Crawley would remount her soapbox on this issue during dinner, but when he asked Anna, who'd been waiting at table alongside Carson, whether anything interesting had happened, she shook her head and whispered, "Not here," under cover of the sound of all of them sitting down. More loudly, she reported on the Dowager Countess, quipping that Downton was now
Like living in a second-rate hotel, she said.
Thomas scoffed. When has she been in a second-rate hotel, I wonder? Half the fun of saying things like that these days was watching Carson draw himself up, and then remember he wasn't allowed to scold Thomas anymore. After dinner, Anna followed Thomas out into the courtyard. "All right, what?" he said, lighting a cigarette. Anna bit her lip.
At dinner, the Dowager was talking to Lady Sybil about how in war one can make friendships that aren't quite appropriate.
For a half second, Thomas wondered just what she was implying, before he remembered that everyone in the house knew better than to suspect him of an inappropriate friendship with anyone female. She went on.
You haven't said anything to anyone, have you?
"No!" Thomas said scornfully, realizing after he said it that the correct response would have been said anything about what. "You know about that too, do you?" In that case, she was in no position to cast stones about him keeping the information to himself.
She said a few things,
Anna admitted.
and the night the General came,
"Yes?"
the note I found, it was in her bedroom.
"He was in her bedroom?" "No!" Anna said quickly.
It was on the floor, like he'd pushed it under the door,
She explained.
They haven't done anything more than talk. If they had, I'd have told someone.
"If it comes out, they'll say you ought to have told someone anyway," Thomas pointed out.
Like you have?
She asked. "I don't work for them," Thomas reminded her. Then, grudgingly, he admitted, "So it's the ward's sister I haven't told, and technically she only said I was to inform her if any of the nurses seemed to be getting close to any of the patients or orderlies." From the look on Anna's face, she knew as well as he did that that kind of parsing wouldn't do him any good if it came down to it.
I was hoping she'd get over it before any of them found out, she said.
"They might not have," Thomas pointed out. "If she knew any details, would the old lady really bring it up at dinner? In front of the servants?"
Likely not,
Anna admitted.
but she might suspect.
"Well, it's nothing to do with me," Thomas said. "What did Nurse Crawley say?"
Just that her nursing kept her too busy for anything else, and then her ladyship changed the subject,
Anna reported. That was a little strange too, but before Thomas could say so, the door opened and Bates stepped out, carrying Anna's shawl over his arm. As he tucked it around her, she said,
I was just telling Thomas that you've had another letter.
"So Bates didn't know about Nurse Crawley and Branson. Interesting."
Yes,
Bates said.
my friends dealt with the register book as you suggested. But more importantly, they've been back again. 2 weeks to the day after their first rendezvous.
"Sloppy," Thomas noted. Things like that were how you got caught. Though Mrs. Bates and her adulterous lover would have less to worry about on that score than anyone Thomas knew. Might be one of them works nearby and that's their regular evening out. Bates nodded.
Vera takes work as a lady's maid sometimes. At any rate, my friend has a good idea. He suggested I engage a private detective.
Oh, yes, he could do that, couldn't he? Funny what options were available to you when you weren't breaking the law. Isn't that expensive?
I'll bet Bunny knows one or two that come round the hotel from time to time asking questions about the sort of thing. He thinks one of them might take it on at a discount to keep on his good side. And if they're foolish enough to keep using the same hotel, it won't be a difficult job.
Good, Thomas said vaguely. It sounded as though Bates' mate had it all sewn up, so what did they want from him? No answer came. Instead, Anna changed the subject to William and Captain Crawley.
What do you suppose could be keeping them?
There were a couple of obvious answers, but Thomas said only, "Could be anything." A bit later that night, though, he found out that the news was a bit worse than any of them had known at the time. On his final walk-through of the wards before going up to bed, Thomas paused to tidy up the recreation room a bit, one of those little things that was being neglected now that they were so short-handed. As he was doing it, Miss Hughes came in, crossing the room to make sure that the French doors leading out to the terrace were latched. "I checked those," Thomas pointed out to her. Turning away from them, she said,
I'm sure you have. I suppose I'm feeling restless.
Thomas had the distinct impression that she wanted to tell him why.
Oh?
I expect you've heard that his lordship had a telephone call during dinner.
Anna had not in fact disclosed that particular tidbit, but Thomas nodded knowingly and made an encouraging noise.
It was the War Office.
Thomas's stomach dropped. Why, he couldn't have said.
It seems that Mr. Matthew and William went out on a patrol a couple of days ago and didn't return.
That was never good.
Oh,
She went on.
I thought you might have some idea. Well,
She smiled weakly.
what the reasons might it be?
Exactly what you think they are.
there aren't a lot of good ones, I'm afraid.
Wishing for a cigarette, Thomas took a deep breath.
Besides the obvious,
That they were captured or dead.
sometimes people who are wounded take shelter in a shell hole or something like that, and they aren't found for a while. Did they say anything about the rest of the patrol? If anyone who went out with them made it back?
Miss Hughes shook her head.
If they did, his lordship didn't pass it along to Mr. Carson.
No, he supposed he wouldn't have.
If anyone from the patrol was able to report what happened to them, they'd likely have told his lordship. They do everything they could to bring them back if they were known to be wounded.
Or to bring back their identity discs if they'd been killed.
If no one knows what became of them, that likely means either no one from the patrol made it back, or they got separated before whatever happened.
Do they often get separated?
Miss Hughes asked.
Often enough.
Usually because things had gone completely to shit. But sometimes there was a survivor or two.
If the sector's very active, it wouldn't take much of an injury for 1 or 2 men on their own to decide the best thing is to take shelter somewhere and wait for things to quiet down.
That was the most hopeful scenario, really.
But if the sector's very active, it's also... You don't send out a burial detail if they'd be risking their lives to do it.
Miss Hughes closed her eyes briefly.
I see.
Thomas added,
If the sector's quiet, then the fact that they haven't
found the bodies.
been confirmed dead is a good sign. But I don't suppose we know anything about what the sector's like.
No.
She agreed.
Depending on how wide no man's land is at that particular spot, there's even a chance they're just lost.
Thomas added.
Some places the lines are so close together you can see what the enemy's eating for breakfast, but others, they can be up to a mile apart. And the terrain changes every day from shelling, so it's easy to get turned around.
So they could be all right.
They could, Thomas hesitated. It isn't especially likely, but they could be.
Miss Hughes sighed.
I suppose that's something.
She helped him finish straightening up the room, but there wasn't much to do, and they soon switched off the lights and went into the main hall. Thomas was wondering whether he ought to go and check on the night shift one more time. It was Griff and one of the new men, when the new man came out of the east ward and hurried toward him.
Sarge, he said, glad I caught you. I wasn't sure if I ought to wake Griffiths or not, but... What?
Thomas asked.
I saw one of the officers going up that staircase we're not supposed to go near.
Thomas and Miss Hughes exchanged a look. That staircase was the one leading up to the maids' bedrooms.
Thank you, Private,
Miss Hughes said and hurried off that way. Thomas lingered long enough to ask,
Which officer was it?
as if he didn't know.
Don't know all the names yet, Sarge, he said apologetically. Dark hair, moustache.
Brilliant! Thomas growled.
Thanks, as you were.
He rushed after Miss Hughes, realizing only as they started up the forbidden staircase that he was technically not supposed to be there either. But Miss Hughes didn't stop him, though she did at the top gesture for him to stay back. She went about halfway down the corridor and quietly opened a door. After peering inside, she withdrew, closing the doors quietly as she'd opened it and shook her head grimly. Then, from behind the door nearest Thomas, came a distinctly feminine giggle. He was about to throw open the door before he remembered that this was the girls' corridor, so there were plenty of legitimate reasons for a girl to be giggling here. Miss Hughes, however, didn't seem to think so. She barreled up the corridor, and Thomas stepped aside just in time for her to throw open the door. Switching on the electric lights, she revealed a sort of lumber room with bits and bobs of old furniture and a makeshift pallet with 2 occupants. Ethel! Miss Hughes thundered.
Major!
Thomas said grimly. The pair were covered by a sheet, but it was clear enough, even without tallying up the clothing scattered around them, that they didn't have much on, if anything, underneath it. Major Bryant essayed,
We'll only...
I know precisely what you were doing, Major.
Miss Hughes interrupted.
I may not be a woman of the world, but I don't live in a sack.
As she spoke, Brian started getting up, a sheet clutched around his waist. Fortunately, Ethel was left with another one, which she clutched to her chest wide-eyed. Still, Thomas averted his eyes, and Miss Hughes averted hers in the opposite direction, continuing,
Now, if you will kindly collect your things and go downstairs.
Bryant grabbed his clothes and scuttled out without so much as a backward glance for Ethel. Thomas hesitated, wondering precisely what his responsibility was. He was still trying to figure it out when Miss Hughes said,
Ethel, you are dismissed. Without notice and without a character, you will please leave before breakfast.
Really? Ethel didn't look like she believed it either.
I didn't think No, said Miss Hughes. And that's the problem. You never do.
She left, sweeping past Thomas, her heels clicking down the corridor. Thomas glanced at Ethel, shrugged slightly, and pulled the door closed. He caught up to Miss Hughes on the stairs. I suppose you have to sack her, he said uncertainly.
I do,
she said, looking straight ahead. There isn't anything you can...
No.
Thomas didn't protest any further. It was, after all, the same outcome he'd have expected if he'd been stupid enough to get caught any of the times he'd done exactly, well, nearly, what Ethel just had. Except that he'd have had to consider himself lucky not to have the police called. When they reached the first floor, Miss Hughes continued down the servants' stairs, but Thomas let himself out into the guest corridor. He was just in time to see the tail end of Major Bryant's sheet disappearing inside the door to the WC. Thomas waited outside of it and once again wished for a cigarette. At least the wait for the Major to put his clothes back on gave him a bit of time to plan. He didn't know what his official response would be, but this part was familiar enough, except that it was usually Theo or Peter who did the talking. Thomas's job was to stand there looking menacing. Finally, Bryant emerged. Sergeant, he said, and made as though to walk down the corridor to his assigned bedroom. Thomas stepped into his path. Major, Ethel's been dismissed from her job. I'm sorry to hear that, Bryant said. Now, if you'll excuse me. He moved to go around Thomas. Thomas blocked his path again. Without notice, or wages anew. Major Bryant stared at him for a moment, then chuckled. Sergeant, if I were inclined to pay for it, I'd be a great deal more particular than that. Fuck! Usually, if they didn't take the hint, Thomas moved on to threats. But there wasn't a lot he could threaten the Major with. He didn't have much to fear from exposure of his deed, and they both knew striking an officer was a serious offense. He bluffed. Colonel Grantham won't like hearing of this. I don't expect he will, Bryant said, but she's of age and came to me willingly. I'll be back at the front soon enough, and no one's going to care what I got up to with a round-heeled housemaid. Now, Sergeant, stand aside. Lacking any better option, Thomas stood aside.
Would you like me to speak to her? Anna suggested, checking the wardrobe as Ethel had asked. Because I can.
All Ethel had said was that she'd been sacked and had to leave before breakfast.
No, she won't listen,
Ethel said, her voice thick with tears. Anna found a blouse of Ethel's and took it over to her.
She's not a bad person, Miss Hughes. I know she can be strict, but she's not.
Ethel snatched the blouse out of her hands.
She won't listen.
With that, Ethel started to cry openly. Anna, unsure what else to do, helped gather up a few more of her things.
Where will you go?
She asked. Shaking her head, Ethel said,
I don't know. Not home.
Ethel never spoke about her home, and Anna never asked. She didn't want to talk about hers either. Whatever was happening, Anna had work to do, so she soon had to leave Ethel to her tears and get herself ready for the day. By the time she returned from taking her turn in the bathroom, Ethel had gone. When she got downstairs, Thomas was lingering by the door with his greatcoat on. At the sight of her, he took hers off its peg and shoved it at her. Ethel's gone, he reported as soon as they were outside. The courtyard's flagstones were white with frost, and his breath streamed like smoke.
I know, she said. She wouldn't say what happened, just that she'd been sacked without notice.
Miss Hughes caught her and Major Bryant having it off, he said.
What?
I told him she'd been sacked, but he didn't give a toss, Thomas went on. Not sure what to do.
Miss Hughes won't reconsider.
Now she knew why Ethel had been so sure. I gathered, Thomas said. He went on as though continuing an earlier thought. It's not a crime, and he's not married, so blackmail's out. If he weren't an officer, I'd get a couple of lads and rough him up a bit, but striking an officer's a military offence. Capital offence, technically. They wouldn't really, but I'd lose my stripes for sure, and I don't even like her."
Anna shook her head. Every once in a while, it became startlingly clear that Thomas lived in a different world from the rest of them. "What is it you want Major Bryant to do?" she asked once she'd pieced together the references to an officer and blackmail. Thomas looked at her as though she were the one missing something obvious.
"Pay her wages in lieu of notice."
Good God, she isn't a prostitute!
Anna whispered angrily.
"No one said she is," Thomas retorted. "She lost her job on account of him. Least he could do."
It had, Anna reflected, been a long time since Thomas had said one of those things that made her not sure whether to slap him or feel sorry for him.
"You're saying," she essayed, "that if something like that happened to
You?
one of your friends, you'd expect the gentleman to pay him?"
Thomas nodded, as though she had just asked him to clarify that water was wet.
"If he's any sense of decency, yeah."
Oh, Thomas.
"Ethel," she said carefully, "is a woman. The decent thing for Major Bryant to do would be to marry her."
A sudden image bloomed in her imagination of Thomas seeking to beat or blackmail Bryant into doing just that.
And he won't do that either.
If the situation hadn't been so serious, Thomas's look of puzzlement would have been funny.
"So what is he supposed to do?"
Anna sighed.
"Nothing," she said. "He doesn't have to do anything. Like you said, it isn't a crime and no one's going to think any less of him for doing it."
Was it possible somehow that Thomas didn't know that?
"They'll only think less of her for letting him."
Leaning back against the wall, Thomas lit a cigarette. "Well," he said around the cigarette, "he's even more of a prick than I thought." Anna might have quibbled with his language, but she didn't disagree.
"Yes."
Taking the cigarette out of his mouth and blowing out smoke, Thomas said,
"So he'll be no help. What are we going to do?"
"Do about what?"
"You mean about Ethel?"
She wasn't sure what else he could mean.
"Yeah."
"Nothing," she said. "She made her bed, now it's hers to lie in."
Thomas gave her a skeptical look.
"You sure?"
Now that he mentioned it, Anna was starting to have doubts, but she said firmly,
"I'm sure."
They went into breakfast. Nothing was said about Ethel, except for the new hall boy asking where she was. Miss Hughes answered him with a sharp,
"Never you mind."
but Anna found her eyes returning to Ethel's empty seat the way a tongue sought out a missing tooth. Ethel had made her bed. How many times had Anna warned her that carrying on with Major Bryant was insane? The girl had insisted she'd no illusions about the Major marrying her. He was too far above their station. But she'd said he was fun. Well, she'd had her fun, and now she was a fallen woman. She wondered what Thomas thought they should do, apart from extorting money out of the Major. She wondered how it was that Thomas, scheming, prickly Thomas, who was a lot better now but still not nice, was the only one of them to even think they ought to do anything.
"Daisy, you're not to worry about William,"
Miss Hughes announced, coming into the servants' hall as Daisy was apathetically laying the table for luncheon. Thomas had come down a little while ago on the pretext of a midday cup of tea, wondering if there'd been any developments in any of the half-dozen or so crises that were currently going on. He'd found no one in the servants' hall except O'Brien, which put paid to his hopes of information gathering, but had stayed for the cup of tea out of stubbornness. Now he looked up at Miss Hughes. Had she heard something new? Apparently not. She went on,
"I spoke to his lordship, and he says you're not to be concerned until we know more."
Right, Thomas thought. Just order her not to be concerned. That'll work. Daisy, to her credit, wasn't buying it either.
"But he is missing," she said. "I mean, they don't know where he is, or Captain Crawley."
In a soothing voice, Miss Hughes said,
"There could be 100 explanations."
"Yes," O'Brien said tartly. "And one of them is that they're dead." Thomas had been thinking the same thing, but assumed an innocent expression as Miss Hughes gave O'Brien a shocked glare. Daisy, Thomas noticed, looked stricken. "Don't mistake me," O'Brien said, looking at Daisy. "I hope very much that they're not. But we ought to face the truth."
"What, me be true?"
Miss Hughes corrected.
"And very well may not.
She swept out, and after a moment, O'Brien got up and left too. She'd be going to the courtyard for a smoke, Thomas reckoned, and for an instant he thought about following her. But now Daisy was slipping into the chair opposite him.
Do you think they are then? Dead?
Thomas hesitated. It's hard to say. He'd been fairly discreet in what he'd told Miss Hughes, but he didn't think he could say even that much to Daisy. You know, I'm not one to give false hope, he said instead, but there's a chance they're not.
How much of a chance?
Honestly, Thomas didn't know why everyone expected him to know. They'd have said if anyone had... No, he couldn't say seen them killed or found the body. Any particular reason to believe they'd been killed. If they're saying they don't know, it's because they don't know.
Daisy nodded tightly.
But something bad has to have happened.
There was only one way of answering that, and no way of softening the blow either. Yeah, he went on. They could be hurt and trying to make their way back to our lines. You know if Captain Crawley was hurt, William wouldn't leave him.
No, Daisy said, looking hopeful. No, I'm sure he wouldn't.
I doubt Captain Crawley'd leave William either. Not unless they were sure of being able to send help back, at least. Or, of course, one of them could be dead and the other injured, or both injured. They could even have made it to a dressing station or another unit's aid post or something, and just haven't been reported. If it's busy, keeping the casualty lists up to date isn't anyone's first priority. If that was the case, though, with the War Office asking questions, they should get an answer soon.
That makes sense, Daisy said. She twisted a corner of her apron in her hand. What if they've been captured?
Thomas wasn't sure. I don't know exactly how it works, but they always told us if we get wounded prisoners, we're supposed to make sure we identify them so their families can be informed. That was a bit of a lie. What they really emphasized was that if a prisoner died, you were supposed to collect his identity discs. But presumably live prisoners were accounted for at some point. It all goes through the Red Cross, so I expect it takes a while. But the arrangement is that we do it for them, so they do it for us. You'd get word eventually. Miss Crawley would, and William's dad. Thomas wasn't sure if they notified fiancés. Daisy shook her head.
Since we found out, everyone looks at me
like they had looked at him in the days between the sinking of the Albion and the Telegram, Thomas thought.
Yeah.
I don't know what I meant to do. Just keep on... I mean, we don't know that anything has happened.
Oh, I know, Thomas said. She looked down at her hands.
This is what it was like when Mr. Fitzroy...
Yes, Thomas lit a cigarette. If I knew how to make it easier, I'd tell you. But I don't.
Daisy!
Miss Patmore's voice came up the corridor from the kitchen, followed by the woman herself.
What are you dawdling about for?
It was the sort of thing she normally said, but on her face was that look Daisy had been talking about. Pity covered over with a mask of everything is all right, and a touch of maybe if we pretend nothing's happened, nothing will.
Yes, Miss Patmore?
Daisy said, jumping to her feet and making a show of gathering up the lunch things.
If Daisy was getting back to work, Thomas supposed he ought to as well. Going upstairs, he chased a few men out of the orderly's room. The new men in particular had a tendency to grind to a stop if he took his eyes off them, and then settled into some of his ever-present paperwork. He managed to get a bit done when Nurse Crawley came in with the numbers he needed for some supplies requests. After handing them over, she lingered, talking aimlessly about the organization of the supply room. Thomas couldn't exactly chase her out, but he could use her loitering more productively. When she touched on the subject of intravenous saline, he said, "Speaking of that, what do you think of Sister Crawley's blood grouping drive?" She had decided recently on that name for it, like a whilst drive, or more to the point, a scrap metal collecting drive. Nurse Crawley easily accepted the change of subject and nattered on for a while about the value of blood transfusion and the need for more donors. All things Thomas knew at least as well as she did, but he was glad she was enthusiastic about the project. Anna and Bates had dutifully spoken to their respective charges about the project, emphasizing that many of the servants would be taking part, but had stopped short of actually pressing Colonel Grantham or the young ladies to do likewise. Thomas had decided it was time to bring in bigger guns. Eventually, Nurse Crawley said,
"The difficulty will be getting people to turn out to be tested. No one's going to want to be first."
"Well, she can count on the servants," Thomas said. "I've talked most of them into doing their bit."
"Have you?"
She looked interested.
"Who is going?"
Anna and Mr. Bates, Miss Hughes. As Thomas went on listing them, he realized why she was probably asking. I haven't had a chance to speak to the outdoor staff.
I could do that, she said eagerly.
Thomas just bet she could. That would be a help, he said straight-faced.
And then he'll see, she went on, bringing hot drinks to a lot of randy officers. That's what he said my work is. I should have slapped him.
Thomas probably would have. Or punched him, rather, despite recent evidence of one specific officer's randiness. What brought that on? He wondered. If it was a sign that her and Branson's whatever it was dying a natural death, he likely ought to encourage it. Except that if she kept on about this subject, she was bound to mention a name sooner or later, and then he'd really be unable to pretend ignorance. He was already regretting asking the question, and regretted it even more when she answered it.
We were talking about what we're going to do after the war, she said. He wants to go back to Ireland and join the rebellion.
She peered through the linen shelves, checking that they were alone.
And he wants me to go with him.
Oh, fuck. That was precisely the kind of direct and certain knowledge that Thomas was better off not having if he wanted a quiet life.
I don't know if I'm going to, she went on. I'm not even certain that I like him that way. And of course my parents wouldn't understand. Or my sisters. Do you know what Mary said?
Oh, thank God. If no less than Lady Mary knew about this, then surely he could claim to believe that the matter was well in hand and there was no call for him to speak up.
This isn't fairyland. Do you think you'll marry the chauffeur and we'll all come to tea?
She said in a stuck-up voice that Thomas supposed was meant to be Lady Mary's.
He isn't just a chauffeur, she continued in her normal voice. He's a person. A very interesting person. He has thoughts and ideas.
Yes, they all knew plenty about Branson's thoughts and ideas. Thomas thought in vain of how he could get her back on the subject of the blood-grouping drive, or organizing the supplies room. He was in no position to be choosy.
But he doesn't understand either, she added. I suppose he just sees, well, the clothes and the house and the grand dinners, but they are my family. We may not be the same as other families, but I wouldn't want to lose them forever.
Her mention of losing them forever made Thomas wonder if she knew that Captain Crawley was missing. If she did, Thomas wondered at her ability to be so preoccupied with her fling with the chauffeur, or at Lady Mary's to make cutting remarks about fairyland, for that matter.
Perhaps Colonel Grantham had decided not to trouble the ladies until more was known.
No, of course not, Thomas agreed. She sighed.
But I don't want to lose him forever either.
She studied her hands folded in her lap for a moment.
He says they'll come round eventually. I wish I could believe him. Do you think they will?
Thomas half wanted to point out that they were her family. All he did was stick their dinners in front of them. He settled on a gentler version. You know them better than he does.
I suppose I do, but I don't know how they'll react to something like this.
By sacking Branson, probably, and making sure the next chauffeur they hired was over 40 and had halitosis or ear hair or something. Thomas was saved from having to come up with a response by another of the VADs sticking her head in the door.
Nurse Crawley, weren't you going to help me with Captain Ainsley's therapy? Oh! She jumped to her feet. Yes, of course, I'll be right there. Sergeant, I'll speak to my family about the blood grouping drive. I'm sure some of them will want to help.
Excellent, Thomas said. Thank you, Nurse Crawley. They had not, as far as Thomas could recall, actually talked about her persuading the family to lend their support to the blood grouping drive. But when Thomas checked with her about it later, she said that she would, and then kept him up to date on her progress. A few days later, when he met with Sister Crawley at the hospital to go over the next duty roster, he was able to report that Lady Edith had agreed to take part, and Lady Mary and Colonel Grantham were taking it under consideration. Lady Grantham has meetings that day in Ripon, apparently.
The other 3 shall be enough,
Sister Crawley said distractedly. They'd had no more news about Captain Crawley, despite Colonel Grantham being on the telephone to the War Office every other minute. So her heart wasn't in it. She said nothing about the crippled ex-soldier either, and agreed without argument to whatever he suggested about the duty roster. Thomas managed to resist the temptation to take advantage of the situation to nab some of the more experienced and reliable personnel for the convalescent home. They'd be needed more at the hospital with the ward sister so preoccupied. He also abandoned his half-thought-out notion of asking her views on Ethel's predicament. He'd duly reported the incident to Major Clarkson, who had confirmed, mostly through what he didn't say, Bryant's claim that no one would care about what he'd done. "I'll speak to him again about being on his best behavior," he said, "but he won't be with us much longer before his medical panel." Sister Crawley, he thought, could normally be relied upon to take a more active approach to the matter, but even so, Thomas was unsure whether she'd intervene to help Ethel or to make trouble for Major Bryant, the latter of which would undoubtedly roll downhill. Now, with things being anything but normal, there was no guessing what she might do. The orderlies working at the hospital this week had reported that she went from seeming in a daze to being snappish and short-tempered. Thomas had had to explain to them that her son was missing to prevent riots. As they wrapped up the meeting, she said, "I don't suppose that Cousin Robert has found out anything." "No, Mum," Thomas said. "I'm sure if he did, you'd be the next to hear."
"Yes, of course," she said, moving her copy of the duty roster from one hand to the other as though she'd forgotten why she had it. "I may be late to the concert tonight. I'll need to make sure everything is settled here before I can go up."
"Yes, Mum." He hesitated. "I'm sure no one could object if you missed it. In the circumstances."
She drew herself up. "No, we must carry on. The patients are looking forward to it."
Thomas couldn't really argue with that. Although if he'd had an excuse to miss the concert, he'd take it like a shot. The rehearsals were bad enough. And started back for the house. The mood at the house was strange that evening. The patients, who knew nothing of Captain Crawley and William's disappearance, were in uncomplicated high spirits about the change in routine. The performers were nervous or exciting according to their temperaments, and their friends either bucking them up with encouraging words or teasing them about the prospect of disaster according to their temperaments. Anna reported that Lady Mary, who'd been given the news the night before, almost the last to know apart from Lady Grantham, had wanted to bow out of performing, but Colonel Grantham had given her a stern lecture about carrying on and not spoiling the patient's good time. The rest of the family and household staff, in a similar light, were going around with pasted-on smiles. The convalescent home staff, in mirror image, assumed grave expressions whenever they came in contact with the family or household. They were universally aware of the situation, some because they'd required an explanation of Sister Crawley's state of mind, some through ordinary gossip. But at this point in the war, they'd all seen too many horrors to be bothered much about a couple of complete strangers going missing in action. It was far easier to share in the patient's excitement about the concert, since a thing like that didn't happen every day. Thomas didn't care either way. The concert was nothing to him except a bit of extra work, and he supposed he'd be sorry if William and Captain Crawley were dead, but he'd seen too many horrors to be bothered much about a couple of acquaintances. Well, except for the small and vicious part of him that at odd moments popped up to whisper in his ear, "But if they are, then they'd all know. They'd know what it's like, and wouldn't that serve them right?" Mostly, Thomas put those thoughts aside and concentrated on directing the men in setting up chairs, a motley assortment scavenged from all over the house, and then in getting the wheelchair cases into position at the front of the audience. When the concert began, he stood at the back, between the servants and the orderlies. There were recitations, songs, and then, like a punch in the gut, a crosstalk act featuring an artillery captain in comedy drag. Nearly everyone found it hilarious, except for Carson, who turned to granite and fixed his eyes on a point 2 or 3 yards to the right of the improvised stage, and Thomas, who thought of Syl and felt like weeping. A few turns later came Major Bryant, doing an execrable magic act. Handkerchiefs out of the sleeve, flowers out of a hat, that sort of thing. And then Lady Mary and Lady Edith. Lady Edith had been playing piano for most of the other acts, but Lady Mary made a grand entrance, proclaiming something about how rare it is to see my sister Edith and I pulling together in a double act, but in wartime we, like all of you, have more important things to worry about. Thomas wondered when she'd come up with that introduction. A week ago, he'd have hoped she'd joke on it, but now he supposed it was true. She started singing. "Sometimes when I feel blue." Now, for the first time, Thomas wondered why, as the sole 2 female performers, unless the artillery captain counted, they'd chosen a lover's duet. It was a crowd pleaser, though, with most of the audience joining in on the chorus.
If you were the only girl in the world, and I were the only boy. Then, near the end of the song, Lady Mary's voice faltered, her eyes fixed on a point to her right. Thomas had half a second to wonder if she was about to break down, and if so, what ought to be done about it, before he heard a gasp from someone among the servants. He looked over and saw William and Captain Crawley. His stomach plunged down into his boots, and he mixed the next few moments. There was movement, glad cries, Sister Crawley embracing Captain Crawley. Thomas stood rooted to the spot, staring at the point that had so arrested Carson's attention during the drag act. Captain Crawley said something about not stopping on his account and picked up the song where they had left off. They sang the last few lines, the audience joining in again, and the moment it was over, it was the last act. Thomas found himself striding over to the green baize door and then clattering down the steps as if to outrun. He didn't know what. He didn't know why he'd come down here. His office would have made more sense. Or his bedroom. Suddenly both of those places seemed very far away. He scrubbed his hand across his face and thought he might be sick. Another set of footsteps was coming down the stairs. Lighter than his own, but just as quick. "Thomas?" Anna called. He had to get rid of her before she saw him puking, or worse, crying. "I'm all right," he was going to say, or maybe fine. What came out instead was a sob. "Thomas," she said more gently.
Go away!
Instead, she put a hand on his shoulder, tisking. "We're all a bit overwhelmed," she began.
Thomas shook his head. I don't care about them. It's not...
He knew how petulant and childish it sounded even as he was saying it.
It isn't fair. She doesn't even want to marry him, but she gets him back.
"Oh," she said. "Thomas!"
Shut up!
With trembling hands, Thomas took out his cigarettes, opening the case away from him so he wouldn't see the picture. Peter lit it for him, though, because he always did.
It isn't...
He shook his head.
I'm only saying...
Anna said, there, or something like that, and led him into the boot room. Good thinking. Anyone could come down and see him bawling at the bottom of the steps. Also, he could grab a saucer to use as an ashtray. Miss Patmore wouldn't like it, but they'd all like it even less if he got ashes on the floor. With his luck, he'd probably drop the coal and burn the house down. Anna disappeared for a bit and came back with a cup of tea. "Drink this up," she said. "You'll feel better." He wouldn't, Thomas knew, but he'd have to stop crying to do it. That was nearly the same thing. Obediently, he drank it.
Aren't you supposed to be serving the punch?
He asked once he'd gotten a grip on himself. "Someone else can do it," she said. You're thinking about Mr. Fitzroy? That's what this is?"
What else would it be?
Thomas almost shrieked. She took a deep breath and said calmly, "You've barely mentioned him since you've been back."
Barely mentioned him when he was alive, did I?
Thomas snarled. That wasn't really true. There had been a few months between the start of the war and Peter's death where the subject had been somehow miraculously speakable. "You can," she said, "if it would help."
It won't.
Nothing would help.
He's still going to be dead.
That was nothing new. It had never been any different, but...
The war's going to end, and he's still going to be dead.
"Well, yes," Anna said cautiously. She was too polite, or perhaps too afraid of setting him off again, to ask why he was stating the obvious, but of course he had to sound mad.
I just haven't been thinking about it, he said. This, the front, the hospital, the convalescent home, it's not real life. But one day it'll all be over, and
then you'll have to face it," Anna said.
He nodded. Right now, it's like nobody's really alive. Men, I mean, we're just not dead yet. But once it's over, then we'll know. We'll know who's made it through, and then the dead will really be dead.
The explanation, Thomas thought, couldn't have made him sound any less mad.
And that's what it'll be like,
he added, jerking his thumb up at the ceiling.
Some of them come back to life, and the lucky ones, so happy.
Sniffling, he wiped his eyes.
It isn't just Peter. If I had Peter, I wouldn't mind about the rest of them, but everyone I knew before the war is dead.
He sniffled again. God, crying was disgusting.
On top of everything else, I'm going to have to find a job, and I've never actually done that without Theo.
Even the job here, Theo had known someone who known someone. Theo? Anna asked.
How to explain Theo? He was a butler,
Thomas said.
I watched him die.
Suddenly he remembered O'Brien asking in a fury of grief, "Why are you still here?" No wonder she hated him. Was that why he hated Carson so much more now? Because he was alive when Theo wasn't?
He looked out for us, Thomas added. All of us. He joined up to look after Syl, only Syl died first. They made him a sergeant, but he was good at it.
Go on, Anna said when he fell silent.
Thomas shook his head. Got to get a grip on myself. He lit another cigarette. They'll be wondering what we're up to. Anna opened her mouth and closed it again.
I'll get you some more tea.
She fetched it and Thomas pulled himself together, making a few remarks about the quality of the various performances prior to the dramatic finale, helped put him back on an even keel, and he was just about ready to go back upstairs when there was a knock at the back door. With a quick glance at him, Anna went to answer it.
What are you doing here?
Thomas heard her demand of whomever it was.
You can't be here. I need to see Major Bryant,
Ethel said. Thomas stepped out of the boot room. What's going on? He asked. Ethel wore a sort of cardigan too light for the weather.
Sergeant, Anna said, would you go and fetch Miss Hughes, please?
Thomas half expected Ethel to turn tail and run at that, and Anna might have thought so too. But she didn't, and after a moment Thomas said, All right. Miss Hughes was talking to William, who seemed to have been explaining their disappearance. Let us go on leave straight from the dressing station, he was saying. We'd no idea you were worrying. Thomas nodded to him. Miss Hughes, Anna needs you downstairs.
Miss Hughes looked at him with some alarm, then told William, I'll want to hear the rest later.
As she started for the back stairs, she asked,
What's happened? You left in quite a hurry.
Ethel, Thomas said. If she thought that answered both parts of her question, that was her lookout. Downstairs, Anna had let Ethel inside the house, but only into the corridor. Can't stand it no more, she was saying, looking up the stairs. She added, Miss Hughes, you've got to help me.
I haven't got to do anything, Miss Hughes said sharply. But what do you mean? Help with what?
Ethel hugged her arms around herself. I need to see Major Bryant, she said.
It's seeing him that got you into trouble in the first place,
Miss Hughes pointed out. That's just it, she said, her lip trembling. I am in trouble. Anna gasped. You don't mean... Closing her eyes, Ethel nodded. I'm going to have a baby. Fuck me blind. Miss Hughes recovered first and asked,
Does he know?
I wrote to him, she said. A bunch of letters. He hasn't answered. He is... She looked hopeful. Has it gone back to the front? Maybe he hasn't gotten them. He's here, Thomas said. Shall I go and get him?
No, said Miss Hughes firmly. We can't have a scene, she added, glancing from Ethel to Thomas.
Thomas objected. Surely he's got to...
We can't have a scene, Miss Hughes repeated. Nor can we discuss this standing in the passageway. Come here.
She took Ethel into her sitting room, closing the door firmly with Anna and Thomas on the outside of it. In unspoken agreement, they retreated to the boot room. He's got to marry her now, Thomas pointed out. Anna made a sound that was half a sigh, half a laugh. If he meant to do that, he'd have answered her letters. Can't he be made to? Thomas had a vague idea that had happened a time or two on his street growing up.
If he was working class, maybe. Or if she was middle class. But not as it is.
Anna shook her head.
She might have some idea of convincing him, but she's fooling herself.
What will she do then? It was hard enough finding a place without a reference. Once her pregnancy became obvious, it would be impossible.
I don't know, Anna said. I expect she doesn't either.
In due course, the rest of the servants came down to eat a cold supper. Thomas half listened to William telling a jumbled tale of becoming lost while on patrol, ending up behind a much larger German patrol, and hiding, as Thomas had suggested to Miss Hughes, in a shell hole. 3 days we were stuck there with enough to eat once our iron rations were gone. After that, they'd had some more misadventures before ending up in an advanced dressing station, suffering from hunger and exposure. Somewhere in the middle of the tale, Miss Hughes turned up. Ethel wasn't with her. When the party broke up, she drew Thomas aside.
I promised Ethel that we'd make certain that Major Bryant was aware of her situation, she said, in case her letters All of our letters somehow went astray. I'll entrust that to you, Sergeant, if you don't mind.
Thomas nodded. All right. He hesitated. Something else had occurred to him while William had been yammering on, but it was the sort of thing you weren't supposed to say. Is she certain it was him? Miss Hughes gave him a sharp look. I'm just saying, if there's any chance it was Griff, we could put some pressure on him. The threat of reporting his conduct to Major Clarkson to begin with, and if that didn't work, Thomas could beat him up without fear of court-martial. Even if she thinks it probably wasn't, if it's possible, what Griff didn't know wouldn't hurt him, or the unborn child.
He didn't say, Miss Hughes answered, and I hesitate to ask for fear of putting the idea in her head.
Thomas was about to point out that Griff would know for sure if she was lying, but then realized that if she said they had and he said they hadn't, there'd be no way of knowing which of them was lying. I'll ask him, he suggested. There's been no gossip among the orderlies about what became of her, so we won't know there's an even more obvious candidate. And if he confessed, there was no need to tell him.
That might be wise, Miss Hughes agreed. I'd like to think I'd have noticed if she was carrying on with two men under this roof, but, well, if there is any chance he's the one responsible, then he might as well take responsibility.
Right, Thomas said. Griff was still on night duty, so there was no need to waste any time, or to have this conversation at a time when prying ears were likely. Mentally, he began running through the list of available men. He'd want some backup. William was too fresh-faced, the hall boys too scrawny, and Garson... Thomas wouldn't ask Garson to piss on him if he were on fire. I'll get Bates to help, he said reluctantly. Always best to have the advantage of numbers, this kind of thing. Not that Thomas had ever done precisely this kind of thing, but the same principle would apply. He found Anna and Bates in the boot room, talking quietly. She'd evidently brought him up to date on the Ethel situation, and he readily agreed to meet Thomas in his office after he'd finished putting his lordship to bed. That also gave Thomas time to attend to his own work. A number of the orderlies had stayed for the concert and to get the patients settled down again afterwards, but without Thomas there to chivvy them, they'd gravitated instead to the refreshments table. Thomas took the opportunity to shoo them towards their work and make sure that they were well out of earshot before zeroing in on Major Bryant. He was talking to a couple of other officers. When Thomas approached, he made a point, at least Thomas suspected he was making a point, of finishing his anecdote before saying, "What is it, Sergeant?" Thomas looked meaningfully at the other two officers. "You might rather discuss it privately, sir." Bryant glared at him. "I doubt that. Go on." "Break." "A friend of yours has turned up," he said, "wanting to know if you've been getting her letters about her being in the family way." "I have," he said. "Is that all?" "Bryant," one of the other officers began, his tone disapproving. "It's nothing to do with me," Bryant told him casually. Turning back to Thomas, he repeated, "Is that all?" Thomas said, "Yes, sir," because he didn't have any other choice. The patients were in no more of a hurry to be herded off to bed than the orderlies were to herd them, so by the time Thomas made it to his office, leaving Griff and the other nightman to finish setting the main hall back to rights, Bates was already there.
"You all right?"
he asked, eyeing Thomas with suspicion. Or maybe it was concern. They looked similar on Bates. "Fine," Thomas said, had Anna told him about him falling apart like that. Fortunately, Bates didn't press.
"So what is it we're doing here?"
Thomas had given it a bit of thought. "We're not telling him that Ethel's pointed the finger at him," he said. "But if he should happen to get the idea that she has..."
"I see. You think it's likely that he's..."
"Not particularly. But Major Bryant's made clear he's not going to take responsibility." Bates looked skeptical.
"You want to trick him into marrying her while she's carrying another man's bastard?"
"Only if there's a chance it's his bastard," Thomas said. Bates considered.
"I suppose if you did, if there's a chance, he's just as guilty,"
he admitted. "Anyway, all you have to do is stand there and look tough," Thomas added. "You can manage that, can't you? It's the easy part." With obvious reluctance, Bates agreed. Thomas went and fetched Griff.
"What is it, Sarge?"
he asked, coming into the orderly's room. Bates was on his blind side as he entered, and when Griff saw him, he started.
"Look, mate, all I said was that she looked pretty. I know she's a girl."
Bates really was doing an excellent job of looking menacing.
What?
He said. We're not here to talk about Anna, Thomas interrupted before they could get too far off track. Making a few small adjustments to his expression, the set of his shoulders, he said, Ethel.
She hasn't given me the commendations she took up with that officer,
Griff said warily. And what did she give you before that? Thomas asked.
Griff looked back and forth between them. Nothing much. Why, what'd she say?
She says she's up the spout, Thomas informed him.
What mean?
He said quickly. Are you sure? Thomas asked, mock kindly. Think very carefully. Is there anything that might have slipped your mind?
Look,
Griff said.
if it was me, I'd do the decent thing. It's not like she's a taught us nothing, but it was me.
Looking over at Bates, Thomas said theatrically. He says it wasn't him. Looking at him with just a hint of panic, Griff said,
Sarge, there is no chance. If she says different, she's lying, I swear.
Thomas was inclined to believe him, but infused his tone with skepticism as he said, No chance like you didn't? Or no chance like you sold her some line about it not happening if you did it standing up or something?
No chance like the most she ever let me do was touch her tits. Honest, unless you can get a girl up the nut from that, it's gotta be some other bloke. You can put me on report for what I did do if you like, but I won't be blamed for what I didn't. I'd swear it on the Bible if you like.
Thomas sighed genuinely this time. Fine, he said grudgingly.
You believe me?
Griff sounded surprised about it. Why, were you lying?
No, he said, but I thought I was going to have to take a beating before you believed me.
That was the idea, Thomas told him. Go, keep your hands to yourself, and if I find out from Anna that you said anything other than that she was pretty, we'll beat you up twice.
Bar enough,
Griff said and fled.
Well,
Bates said once he had gone.
that's that.
Yeah, Thomas agreed, lighting a cigarette. It was a long shot. He added, You're pretty good at that. Have to remember that.
You didn't seem very impressed the time I tried to put the frighteners on you,
Bates said. Thomas had forgotten about that. It had been something to do with Anna, hadn't it? I don't frighten easily, he said.
No,
Bates said.
I don't suppose you do.
Sitting down across from Thomas, he said,
You're not bad at that yourself. Done it before, have you?
Well, Thomas said, blowing smoke. Not exactly that. But the circles I ran in, sometimes a bloke needs to be reminded of his manners. He studied the burning end of a cigarette. Reckon that's what they kept me around for, my own crowd.
The ones who were all dead,
Bates said. So Anna had ratted him out. Judas. Yes. Thomas stood up, putting out a cigarette, half smoked. I'd better check the main hall than be getting to bed. Morning will be here before we know it. Private Griff is admitted to certain discussions, but not anything that would account for Ethel's current condition, Thomas told Anna and Miss Hughes. They were in the latter's sitting room, which Anna supposed was why he phrased it so delicately. He was rather convincing, so we're no further along, I'm afraid. Miss Hughes nodded.
And I take it Major Bryant was not receptive.
No, Thomas said flatly.
I didn't think he would be, Miss Hughes said. Well, I suppose you've duties to attend to.
I do, Thomas agreed and left. Anna's duty at the moment was to wait for Lady Mary or Lady Edith to ring, which she could do just as well here as in the servants' hall. She lingered, and Miss Hughes didn't chase her out. To the contrary, she waved Anna into one of the chairs in front of her fire and said,
I'm surprised to see Thomas taking this sort of heart.
Anna knew of two reasons why he would. To speak of one would be betraying a confidence, but the other she had pieced together from various stray remarks. She was, she thought, free to speak of it, except that it was a difficult subject to introduce.
He's been missing his friends,
she said, which was the simplest and least objectionable part of it.
His war chums?
Miss Hughes asked.
No,
Anna said.
His and Mr. Fitzroy's friends. Most of them have been killed, apparently.
Thomas had said all, but given it was Thomas, that might have been an exaggeration. Miss Hughes said,
I see,
but she still looked puzzled. Anna attempted to explain.
I gather it wasn't unusual for them to have dealings with gentlemen who behaved in an ungentlemanly manner.
Mr. Bates had told her what they'd discussed the evening before, and she remembered him sounding almost defensive as he explained why he wasn't going to give Major Bryant a thrashing. Further back, she remembered him earnestly offering to give Mr. Bates a thrashing if he laid a hand on her.
Apparently he was sort of responsible for giving short, sharp lessons in manners.
Miss Hughes raised her eyebrows, and I had to admit it was a little hard to imagine suave, not a hair out of place Thomas as bully boy. But Mr. Bates had said it was less difficult to imagine after seeing him talking to Griff like a street tough.
I'm not sure he should be telling you about that,
Miss Hughes noted.
He hasn't described any details, Anna said, and part of it he said to Mr. Bates.
Lest Miss Hughes dwell on Thomas telling her inappropriate things, Anna hurried on.
Anyway, what I meant was that since they're all gone, he's trying to be friendlier to the rest of us.
Everyone I knew before the war is dead, he'd said. That wasn't true. All of them at Downton were still alive, but he hadn't met them.
Only he has some strange ideas about what that means.
She would not, Anna decided, tell Miss Hughes that Thomas had thought that Major Bryant ought to pay Ethel off. Even without her saying that, Miss Hughes looked sad.
Sometimes I wonder, she said, if we're as much of a mystery to him as he is to us.
There were, Anna had to admit, bizarre and startling gaps in Thomas's knowledge of how normal people operated, but she wasn't sure mystery was the word for it.
When she was first dismissed, he seemed to take entirely for granted that we'd do something to help her, even though he made a point of this. He doesn't like her.
Frowning, Miss Hughes said,
He said something like that the night he shouted all those horrible things at Mr. Carson. He said that at the front they had to look out for the next man, whether they liked one another or not.
There was something, Anna thought, that she almost understood, like having a word at the tip of one's tongue. He looked out for us, Thomas had said of his friend. What was his name? The one who had been a butler. Ted? No, Theo. They made him a sergeant, but he was good at it. And something about not knowing how to find a job without Theo.
Yes, she said. I think it must have been like that before the war too, with his friends. They all being like they are and always in danger because of it, they had to rely on each other.
That would explain his surprising success in the army if they operated in a way that he understood. If you didn't have to be liked to be looked out for. They had liked him, his war chums. He'd said so in so many words, and his men here liked him too. But what if that came after? What if, as far as Thomas was concerned, you had to know you could trust someone, had to know they'd look out for you, before there was any question of liking them? He'd kept them all at arm's length, she remembered, until she'd told him that they knew about how he was. To protect his secret, certainly, but perhaps that wasn't all of it. Perhaps he'd been waiting for them to prove they could be trusted before he'd let them get any closer than arm's length. Perhaps while they'd been thinking him cold and unfeeling, he'd been thinking almost the same of them. The new men don't arrive until Tuesday, so we'll be short-handed again, but only for a few days, Major Clarkson was saying. It was the weekly meeting between Thomas, Sister Crawley, and the Major, and Major Clarkson had opened it by explaining the latest personnel transfers. The last of the 11 men they were losing would depart on Sunday. And, Sergeant, you'll be pleased to hear that Corporal Rollins is among them. With everything else that had been happening, Thomas hadn't had much attention to spare for worrying about something that was as thoroughly out of his hands as Rollins's home service assignment was. But it was a tremendous relief to hear it was settled. Thank you, sir. I'm sure we won't disappoint. The usual wrangle over the duty roster ensued, but somewhat to Thomas's surprise, Sister Crawley agreed readily enough to let him have Rollins up at the convalescent home to start. She wanted Corporal Wiggins in exchange, of course, and he had to take the rest of the new arrivals as well. But she'd have asked for the same things even if Rollins wasn't in the picture. The return of Captain Crawley had also meant the return of Sister Crawley's enthusiasm for her various projects, and she brought them up to date, at considerable length, about the progress she had made on organizing the blood grouping drive. Lady Edith had agreed not only to be tested at a time which would make her participation highly visible, but also to persuade the convalescent home patients to take part and to organize getting them down to the village. Colonel Grantham and Lady Mary had also agreed to make an appearance, though they had not promised to actually submit to the needle.
Sister Crawley was convinced she'd be able to talk them into it when the time came. Apart from that, she'd recruited the vicar and his wife, along with a handful of other middle-class notables, so with the Downton servants, and Sister Crawley's servants, they were sure of all classes being represented.
No one will be able to think that it isn't suitable for their sort of person to be our donor,
she explained. She'd accomplished less, but had even more to say about the plight of crippled ex-soldiers living rough. Major Clarkson made a few attempts to rein her in on the subject, pointing out that they were no longer in need of medical care, and in any case their facilities were designated for officers, but she was undeterred.
Some of them, I'm certain, would be more able to work if they had more rehabilitative care, she said. And others are capable of working, but need only be given a chance.
She had a number of castle-in-the-air plans about a rehabilitation clinic, perhaps in the parish hall, an employment bureau, but also had gotten started on a scheme for providing free hot meals.
Miss Bird has been saying that she wants more to do, so she'll do the cooking, and I'll raise funds to buy what's needed. We'll start with once a week, but with the support of the community, we'll be able to expand.
She went on to outline plans for a collection of warm clothing.
And I must find out where they're living, she added. I gather most of them have some sort of roof over their heads, but they've been cagey about precisely where. They may be staying somewhere without the property owner's knowledge.
Major Clarkson broke in. That all sounds very suitable, sister, but perhaps we could put it to one side and talk about which patients will be transferred to the convalescent home? Major Bryant was far from being the only officer with an upcoming medical panel. The concert had been in part a farewell party for a group of them who'd be leaving in the coming week. They hashed out how many of the vacated beds would be needed for patients moving up from their own hospital, and how many could be reported to the War Office as available for transfers from other nearby facilities. By the time the meeting wound down, Thomas was going to be late for the patient's tea, but he nevertheless lingered to speak to Sister Crawley. He opened by asking after Captain Crawley, who was, she said, well.
And how is William? Matthew says they had quite an ordeal.
He's gone to his dad's, Mum. But he seemed well enough while he was here.
Thomas had, in fact, avoided him a bit. William had managed to turn some of his experiences into thrilling tales suitable for telling in the servants' hall, but surely he'd been disillusioned by now about the glories of war. Unless he really was that sick. Thomas had decided he didn't want to find out. To forestall any further questions about William, he went on.
I'm glad you've thought up some ideas for those crippled men. It may not be hospital business, but it really is a disgrace, like you said.
She nodded. I gather the War Office expects their families to look after them, but some of them have no families, and others don't want to burden them.
Speaking of families and burdens, now he'd best butter her up a bit more before broaching the subject of Ethel.
I'm sure they'll be grateful for anything you can do, Mum. I don't mind admitting, when I found out how much use of my arm I'd lost, I was a bit worried about what would become of me.
There was a bit of a lie in that, but it was only that he did, in fact, mind admitting it.
She looked at his shoulder. You know, you manage so well, I'd nearly forgotten. Does it give you much pain still?
A bit, now the weather's turned cold. Can't complain, though.
Well, he could, but it wouldn't do any good. And he really did need to get back up to the house. Looking to one side, he said,
There's something else I wanted to ask you about. Bit delicate.
With a look of mingled concern and avid interest, Sister Crawley drew him into the surgical prep room where they could talk more privately.
You remember Major Bryant?
Thomas said.
The difficulties we've had with him?
Her face took on an expression of distaste.
I do. He is on the list to leave shortly, isn't he?
Yes, Thomas said. The thing is, once the nurses stopped getting within arm's reach of him, he turned his attention to one of the housemaids.
Oh, dear.
She's in trouble, Thomas said flatly. She was dismissed a bit ago because they were caught red-handed, but... Well, I suppose she doesn't have any family she can turn to either. She came to the house a few days ago because she didn't know where else to go.
Have you spoken to Major Bryant? She asked.
I have, and she's written to him several times. He denies responsibility.
She pursed her lips.
When you say they were caught...
There's very little room for doubt.
I see, she said. Well then, he must be made to do the decent thing.
Thomas had, in fact, been wondering if Sister Crawley might have any ideas of a medical nature to eliminate the problem at its source, so to speak, but he saw no way to clarify that.
Miss Hughes and Anna seemed convinced it was impossible, ma'am, him being a gentleman and all.
That's all the more reason he cannot be allowed to shirk his responsibility.
She drew herself up.
I'll speak to him.
Well, if anyone could make a dent in Major Bryant's indifference, it was the steamroller, Thomas thought.
Yes, ma'am,
he said, and reminded her of the date of Bryant's medical panel. Returning to the house, he found, unsurprisingly,
a shambles.
Ambulatory officers were wandering about vaguely in search of tea, while the new orderlies carried it one tray at a time to the bedbound. Thomas got them straightened out. You took everything up to the hall first, so the ambulatories could help themselves, and served the bed cases from there, and put Ethel out of his mind. Sister Crawley was as good as her word, though, and a day or two later she arrived with Major Clarkson for his afternoon round, and when they reached the recreation room, separated herself from the group and made a beeline for the errant Major. Thomas finished the round with Major Clarkson and repaired to his office, where he found Sister Crawley in possession and Major Bryant lolling indolently in one of Thomas's armchairs.
Very sorry, sister, he was saying insincerely, but the girl is no better than she should be. I have no way of knowing that the child, if it even exists, is mine.
You were seen,
Sister Crawley said sharply. I admit I gave way to temptation, but the girl, Ethel is it, was, shall we say, friendly terms with any number of other officers.
Smirking, he got to his feet.
Now, if that's all...
No, that is not all,
Sister Crawley said, but Bryant was already halfway to the door.
Sergeant,
he said with a crisp nod. Thomas shut the door behind him.
No joy, I take it?
No, she said. I don't know how he can call himself a gentleman.
Righteous indignation faltered for a second, and she asked,
I don't suppose it's true, is it, that there are other candidates?
Don't think so, Mum, Thomas said. She'd flirt with anything in trousers, but it doesn't seem to have gone much further than that with anyone else.
Sister Crawley sighed.
If he won't take responsibility, the only thing to do is get her through the pregnancy and have the child adopted. That way she can put this behind her, and the child will have a decent upbringing. There are places for unwed mothers where they take care of the details. I'll make some inquiries.
Somehow Thomas doubted that Ethel would like the sound of that, but he didn't have any better ideas.
Yes, Mum.
Later that evening, he reported her lack of success to Anna, who reported in turn that Bates had had better luck with engaging a private detective.
He'd charge a great deal if he had to keep watch for them at the hotel, but he'll come on the day they're expected, and if they turn up at a different time, Mr. Bates's friend can telephone him, and he'll come and photograph them leaving.
Good, Thomas said, wondering again why she was telling him, if they had everything well in hand. Anna looked at him for a moment, her expression thoughtful.
I'm sorry, she said. Perhaps you'd rather not hear about it. I don't mean to rub it in.
What? Thomas asked, puzzled.
That we're going to be happy, she said.
Oh, that.
It's fine.
Honestly, what was the world coming to if you couldn't weep hysterically one time without people thinking you could go off at any second?
He'd be glad when Rollins came.
He could deal with all of the feeling shit, and Thomas could go back to being a cranky bastard. Facing the long, curving road up the hill, Rollins bent and surreptitiously adjusted the fastenings of his prosthetic foot. He'd reported in at the village hospital, still surprised in the back of his mind not to find it set up in a half-bombed-out church or school, despite being several months back in England, where the ward sister, a civilian nurse, had explained that he wasn't on the duty roster until the next day, with trains being so unreliable, and so he had the rest of the day to get settled in his billet and have a look around the village. His billet had proved to be a pleasant cottage, also free of shell damage, where the householder, a cheerful older woman, had shown him to the room he'd share with the hospital's other corporal. It had been her son's room, she explained, her cheer dimming for a moment. Rollins hadn't asked. The moment had passed, and she'd given him a hearty lunch. Not usually included, she said. The hospital men had it at the hospital or else at the big house. But you couldn't get a decent meal on a train, could you? Especially not these days.
Once he'd polished it off, she told him how to get to the big house, up the hill and you can't miss it, and he'd set out.
His hostess hadn't lied. When he rounded the curve of the wide, well-gravelled lane, the house came into view. High-spired, golden in the winter sunlight, and absolutely enormous. Rollins was glad he had an in with the wardmaster. The whole thing would be awfully intimidating otherwise. He wondered what Barrow would be like here in his usual setting. It was a bit like going to one of your friends' places for the school holidays, wasn't it? You saw a different side of them, sometimes one you'd rather not have seen. Rollins remembered going once to the house of a chap he'd rather admired, cricket captain and all that, only to find that at home he permitted his mother to cut his meat for him and call him Popsy. It was pretty difficult to look at a chap the same way after you'd seen a thing like that. But it wasn't Barrow's home, only the place where he worked, so there couldn't be anything nearly that embarrassing to discover. Up close, the house loomed even larger, and Rollins looked at the double front doors with some apprehension. If you rang the bell, did the fearsome Carson come and open it? Not wanting to risk it, Rollins followed a well-trodden path that curved around the side of the house. It led to a courtyard, which reminded Rollins somewhat of the ambulance yard back at the 47th, except that there was no one in it, except for a girl in an apron and striped dress taking a leg of mutton out of a sort of cupboard built into the brick. The girl was tiny, and seeing her tried to pick up a second leg of mutton while balancing the tub that held the first with her other hand. Rollins hurried forward. "Can I give you a hand with that?" She looked over her shoulder at him. "Please," she said, "take the tray before I drop summons." Rollins took it, and she grabbed the mutton more securely with both hands. "All right there?" She nodded. "I should have made 2 trips, but I didn't want to." She put the second leg of mutton into the tray he held and wiped her hands on her apron. "You're one of the new orderlies, then?" "I am," he said. "Corporal Rollins at your service." She opened the door and held it while he went through. "To your right," she said. Rollins turned to his right, explaining as he went, "I'm not actually on duty until tomorrow. They weren't sure when I'd get here, but I thought I'd give my compliments to the wardmaster." They went into the kitchen, as large as Rollins' mother's dining room and salon combined, and the girl directed him to put the tub on a vast butcher-block table. A round, red-faced woman in an apron and cap turned from the stove and said, "Are you bringing in strays now, Daisy?" "No, Miss Patmore," she said. "He's one of the new orderlies, Corporal Rollins." "Nice to meet you, ma'am," Rollins said. She was the one Barrow said cooked almost as well as Granny then, and who'd be responsible for the fruitcake they'd had that Christmas at the CCS. Miss Patmore snorted. "Charmed, I'm sure." "He's looking for Thomas," the Daisy girl reported. "Do you know where he is?" "I've better things to do than keep track of Thomas," Miss Patmore answered. "Anna might know." "I'll show you where to find her," Daisy said, and led Rollins back the way they came, past the door and into a plain-looking dining room. There was an older man at the table, and several women. Daisy said to one of them, a thin-faced blonde, "Anna, this is Corporal Rollins. He's looking for Thomas." Anna looked up at him. "He'll be doing the rounds with Dr. Clarkson," she said. "You might as well have a cup of tea before he puts you to work." Afternoon rounds took longer than usual, since each of the men was managing more patients than he ought to be, and half of them didn't know what Major Clarkson was likely to ask for, resulting in a lot of scrambling to undress wounds, take temperatures and pulses, and so on. When it was finally over, Thomas thought longingly of his office and a cup of tea and a cigarette, but he knew that once he'd sat down he wasn't going to want to get up again. Best to go downstairs first to check that things weren't piling up too high in the sink room and that preparations for the patient's tea, the next hurdle coming up, were in hand. Nearing the bottom of the stairs, he heard animated voices from the servants' hall. For a moment, Thomas wondered if William was still loitering around, but no. They'd seen him off the day before with great fanfare, and not even Captain Crawley was jammy enough to have gotten a second stretch of home leave right on the heels of the last one. Besides, the voice that was saying, "No, we were sitting on the siding for hours," didn't sound like William. It sounded almost like... Thomas hurried down the last few steps, his tiredness forgotten. It was! Standing in the doorway to the servants' hall, he barked, "Corporal Rollins!" Rollins jumped to his feet and braced up. Thomas had told him about that in a letter. "Wardmaster?" he said formally. Nobody calls me that, Thomas said, thumping him on the shoulder. What are you doing here early? You're not a roster till tomorrow. Rollins thumped him back. Don't know, I heard a mate of mine works here. Yo, who's that? Rollins laughed and thumped it again. Nice to see you haven't changed. Thomas eyed him. He looked all right, fit enough, and he'd stood easily. How's the peg leg? You went right downstairs? Yeah, Rollins said, nodding. As long as I don't rush it, and it helps if I can see my feet. Good, Thomas said. All the stairs in this house. Come on, I've got to check a thing or two down here, and then I'll show you my office. As the two men left the servants' hall, Anna heard the new corporal, Rollins, apparently say, So, do I get a drink in the wardmaster's office now? We'll see, Thomas replied, mock sternly. Rollins laughed and made some reply Anna couldn't make out, and in a few moments their voices had disappeared up the stairs. In the servants' hall, they looked around at one another, everyone else looking as puzzled as Anna felt.
It seems they know each other,
Mr. Bates said into the ensuing silence. Miss O'Brien, at the far end of the table, spoke up. Now I wonder, she said, her voice honey-sweet, why our Sergeant Barrow didn't mention a friend of his was coming. Anna couldn't help wondering the same.